Hello, everyone. Welcome to the second session of the ISJL virtual vacation. My name is Nora Katz. I'm the ISJL's Director of Heritage and Interpretation, and I am your tour guide. So greetings from Natchez, Mississippi. This week's session is a deep dive into the history of one specific place located not too far from the ISJL office. This is a model that some of our future virtual vacation sessions are going to take. So I'm hoping that you'll enjoy it. We have a really special relationship with Natchez. I serve as co-chair of the Temple's Board of Overseers, and I manage programming, fundraising, and restoration efforts at the Temple. One of my favorite parts of my job at the ISJL is telling the story of Natchez. And so I'm really excited to welcome y'all to the city this morning. You're going to learn about the history of this place. You'll get a feel for its culture and meet some of the people who are working together to tell complicated, nuanced, and rich stories of Natchez history that resonate in the present. I should add that at the end of this session, we are going to have some time for Q&A. So I invite you to ask questions in the comments on the live stream, and I'll answer as many as I can at the end. So let's hit the road. Welcome to Natchez. This is a small town with a population of about 20,000 people, and it's a port city along the Mississippi River. These maps just kind of give you a sense of the layout of Natchez and where it is in the state of Mississippi. So I had the chance to speak with a few friends and colleagues in Natchez who are doing really important work to tell the city's stories. So I'm going to interweave these into the presentation this morning. So the first person I want to introduce you to right off the bat is Lance Harris. He is the director of the Grand Village of the Natchez Indians, which is a site that's managed by the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. The Grand Village of the Natchez Indians was once the main ceremonial center of the Natchez people who dominated what is now southwestern Mississippi for over 1,000 years, from about 700 to 1730 CE. I talked to Lance about interpreting this history in partnership with Native American groups, the history of the site, and what he wishes more people knew about the Natchez. So I am going to stop sharing my screen for a moment and cue up this video of my conversation with Lance.
This area in 1682 was the main political and religious center for the Natchez people. When LaSalle came down, he made note of landing in this area as he was coming down to make his way to claim the river and its tributaries for France. And he made note that he traveled inland to visit with the Great Sun. The Grand Village it's really one of the only places that was occupied well and late into the early historic period in North America. There's a voluminous amount of information written about the Natchez people and the things that happened in this area, and particularly at the Grand Village by many, many different French explorers, colonists, that sort of thing. These accounts actually inform a lot of what archaeologists and ethnohistorians think that mound building societies were like prior to Europeans coming to the New World. It's really a fascinating record of the native people, practicing a religion that's and a cosmological belief and a way of life that's well steeped back into antiquity. Really, by the time of significant colonization, the tiered kind of autocratic and aristocratic structure that is thought to be associated with mound building people wasn't the case anymore. Most of the Southeast had more, I don't want to call it egalitarian, but I think there was a wider reach of influence for a variety of different people. The native people, the Natchez people, Natchez people that the French encountered, they still had what they described as a very tiered kind of social structure. Ultimately, the French established a colony among the Natchez that really kind of kicked off in 1716 with the establishment of Fort Rosalie. And then you had two major concessions or plantations that were established in 1719. And that's when you really start having a lot of intense interactivity between French colonists and British colonists and Nachi people. That kind of culminated in November of 1722 with the Natchez Uprising or revolt or massacre or retaliation, wherein the Nachi people essentially attacked the local French colony in the vicinity and pretty much wiped it out. The French did retaliate from that as well too, and they in turn teamed up with some Native American allies, and they seized the Grand Village, and they had a bout of siege warfare against the Natchez, and ultimately pushed them out of this area, for lack of a better term. The Natchez continued to fight against them. They continued to fight against each other, ultimately kind of culminating in a siege battle that happened about a year later in what's now Sicily Island, Louisiana, wherein the Great Sun and many of the upper echelon of the Nachi society were captured and sold into slavery. The Natchez, Nachi people that did escape, many of them went to live with the Chickasaws for a period of time. The French also in turn attacked the Chickasaws for one of those reasons. And then they primarily went to live among Creek and Cherokee communities after that. In fact, you actually have people of Nachi descent living in Oklahoma today who had traveled with these Cherokee and Creek communities during the Trail of Tears that happened in the 1830s. Mounds are monumental earthworks created by indigenous people in the Americas. You see them in South America and North America. But I'll say that some of the most important mounds are really in the lower Mississippi Valley. And Natchez is kind of right smack dab in the middle of all these different mounds that have a variety of different significant attributes to them. All of these mound sites, they go back about 5,000 years ago from when they were constructed. Actually, more than that, probably closer to 6,000 years ago. And I think there's even some newer research that indicates, particularly, maybe even more antiquity. So these mounds have been built in North America for a very long period of time. There's been some fascinating research recently that indicates that these, truncated flat-top mounds really start showing up in the lower Mississippi Valley around the Natchez vicinity and surrounding areas about 700 AD. And not only are, they're flat-topped and they're truncated because they have structures on top of them. So people were actually building temples, houses, that sort of thing on top of these structures. It's actually thought that technology went from the lower Mississippi Valley up to Cahokia and then spread back out. So the Grand Village was one of these sites as well too. The mounds here were truncated pyramids with structures on top of them. The Grand Village is unique in the fact that you have primary resources, written documents, primarily by French colonists that describe the structures on top of a mound, corroborated with archaeological evidence that basically backs it up. That's not to be found anywhere else in North America. In the case of the Temple of the Grand Village too, there's also, a contemporaneously drawn image of the structure on top of the mound. Again, no other place in North America has that. So we have relationships not just with Nachi people, but also Choctaw people and other Native Americans as well too. Natchez people, Nachi people come to the site on a regular basis, primarily during our annual powwow that normally occurs in March. But they also come and have participated in educational offerings that we've had for school children and adults as well too. There's also been Mississippi Choctaws have been very active in participating in that as well also. And we anticipate that there will be much more involvement and participation as we move forward with new interpretation at the site. And so we're really looking forward to that and reaching out to more Native American partners to tell a complete and complex and thoughtful story of the Grand Village site and American Indians in this part of the world. Yeah, there's been I guess you will find particularly in older pieces, you'll often see terms like either last of the mound builders or last of the Mississippian chieftains. And you'll also, refer to, you'll see items that say an exterminated people, or the Natchez Nation was no more at 1731 and things like that. I would make an argument that that's not the case. There are people that claim Natchez descent still living in South Carolina, certainly many in Oklahoma. The Natchez people, again, they have that, there's a serious amount of gravitas, I guess might be one way to describe it. And they certainly have been well reflected throughout historical writings and even among other Native Americans as well too. One thing that I hope that people will take away when they leave the site is how significant the Natchez people played, not just in local history, not just in Mississippi history, not just in American history, but truly in world and international history. It's obvious the impact that they had on the local area, and I think even with the formation of the state of Mississippi. But truly, Natchez people have had a significant international impact on the world. The actions that they took in 1729 against the French colony decimated the colony. If you think about it, the largest agriculturally producing area for the French colony in the lower valley was Natchez, and they obliterated it. They destroyed it, and that really, kicked the French in the teeth. 30 years later, the French Empire in North America was no more.
Amazing. So we just learned about the really early history of Natchez, starting before Mississippi was Mississippi as we know it. And so now seems like a great time to tell you about the city's Jewish community, how it developed, and what it looks like now. So there's been a Jewish presence in Adams County, where Natchez is located, since as early as the 1700s. Jews arrived in what was then a French colony as peddlers, traveling up the state's waterways, selling goods from carts or packs. And as we learned in our first session last week, peddling was a pretty common profession for Jews in Europe, and many continued peddling when they arrived in what's now the United States. Natchez was later under British and then under Spanish control, and Jews lived in the region during and after the American Revolution. So they've been there for a long time. Throughout the late 18th and early 19th centuries, Jews worked as peddlers or as plantation owners in and around Natchez. They also worked as merchants. One notable early resident was Benjamin Monsanto, who was descendant of a Dutch Sephardic Jew. He operated a 500-acre plantation outside of Natchez from 1787, until his death in 1794, and he enslaved 11 people during that time. The Jewish community in Natchez didn't really begin to organize until the 1840s, when immigrants from Alsace-Lorraine and Bavaria arrived in Natchez. Many opened retail stores selling dry goods in what is known as Under the Hill. You can see from this picture, Natchez is up on a bluff, which we'll learn a bit more about later. And Under the Hill is sort of an area of the city that is more sort of at level with the Mississippi River. There was significant movement to Natchez from New Orleans and back. New Orleans is just down the river in a way. The connections between those two cities run really deep, and they remain strong to this day. These Jewish businesses Under the Hill mostly traded in clothing and dry goods, and they grew prosperous on the eve of the Civil War. In 1843, the Jews in Natchez founded Temple B'nai Israel. They wouldn't have a synagogue building for another 30 years. Like many congregations, Temple B'nai Israel began as a burial society that saw its first burial in 1844. And it was formally incorporated with the state in 1848, met for services likely in members' businesses. During the early years of the Civil War, the congregation stopped meeting. It was a tumultuous time. As you can probably imagine, most Natchez Jews supported the Confederacy. Many joined the Confederate Army or worked in supporting roles to bolster the Confederate cause. During and after the Civil War, new Jewish residents arrived in Natchez. A lot of those were folks who followed the Union Army as private support staff and then chose to stay in the South. One of those people, Isaac Lowenberg, would go on to open a business and later become mayor of Natchez, and I'll mention him again in a little bit. Natchez had just one casualty from the Civil War. The city is downriver from Vicksburg, which was the site of the famous siege, and it was never the site of active combat. It wasn't of any sort of strategic importance to anyone. But in 1863, the USS Essex traveled downriver to get ice for its wounded, and the residents of Natchez refused to help and began shooting at the ship. The Essex fired back, and 7-year-old Rosalie Beekman was killed by shrapnel, and she was a member of the Jewish community. You can see this is her headstone in the old Jewish section of the Natchez City Cemetery. After the Civil War, Jewish businesses continued to prosper. Jews made up only about 5% of the city's population at this point, but they owned a third of the businesses in Natchez, which is again sort of a testament to the success that they were able to find as merchants, as peddlers, and then later as merchants. Finally, in 1872, the congregation, Temple B'nai Israel, dedicated its first synagogue on the current site. One writer said, Jews and Gentiles filled the temple beyond its capacity and great crowds stood upon the sidewalks and streets. So this was a moment of great celebration. In the early years of the congregation, before they had built the building, the small group of men who were in charge ran the congregation in the Orthodox tradition, which is pretty typical for sort of more recent immigrants. And then there was kind of some debate about whether to continue in the Orthodox tradition or to embrace reform practices, which were really sort of on the rise in the United States at this moment. The congregation was ultimately founded as a Reform synagogue, and it's a charter member of the Union of American Hebrew Congregations, which is now the Union for Reform Judaism. And this is very much a classical Reform temple, which is really apparent when you look at the building. And you'll see some photographs of the interior in a little bit. The men and women of the congregation formed local chapters of B'nai B'rith and the Council of Jewish Women, respectively, and formed strong Jewish social bonds outside of the synagogue's walls. It does appear that the Temple Sisterhood was very active in trying to drum up attendance at this point, which was apparently an ongoing challenge in those early years. Many may continue to identify with that today. In the 1880s, a lot of successful Jewish merchants built homes in Clifton Heights and throughout the city. And as the community grew more well-established, they were really active in the political and social and economic life of the city. Isaac Lowenberg and S.B. Lau both served as mayor. Another member of the congregation served as deputy sheriff and county treasurer. Several others served as aldermen, trustees of the Natchez Institute, and officers of the Natchez Board of Trade. And the women of the congregation were also very involved in civic life. They served on the boards of the Natchez Protestant Orphan Asylum, which is now Natchez Children's Home Services, and the Natchez City Cemetery Association. The first synagogue building burned in an electrical fire in 1903. And within 2 years, the congregation had raised the funds to build a new synagogue on the same site, which still stands today. The cornerstone of the current temple reads 1904. And in 1905, Natchez reached a peak population of about 450 Jews. So you can see this is a photograph of the current building under construction, and you can see already power lines around it. So there's an undercurrent in all of this, which I'm hoping you're picking up on, but I'm going to make it extremely obvious right now. Why was the white population of Natchez so wealthy? How could the Jewish community afford to build a brand new synagogue with stained glass windows, an organ, and an Italian marble arch just a year after its first temple burned? The Jewish community made their money in the dry goods business in Natchez and throughout the South, which was intimately connected to the cotton economy, which was for many centuries entirely dependent upon the labor of enslaved people. And so the wealth that enslavers and merchants and plantation owners built before the Civil War remained, and it was passed down to future generations. And even after the Civil War and even after Reconstruction, exploitative labor practices left Black Natchez residents impoverished while white folks continued to prosper. So the Jewish community was incredibly wealthy because of this and were able to build this beautiful synagogue. The cotton economy began to fall apart when the boll weevil arrived in 1908, and the Jewish community never really recovered in terms of numbers. By the 20s, the Natchez Jewish population had lost over 300 members. But still many Jewish businesses continued to thrive throughout the 20th century. So at this point, kind of in the early 1900s through the 20s, it was clear to Natchez's white population that something had to change in order for the town to survive and to remain sustainable. And so women, including many, many Jewish women who were members of the congregation, led the charge. They founded local garden clubs and they worked to promote heritage tourism in Natchez, marketing Natchez as this sort of perfectly preserved vision of the Old South and of the lost cause. So you can see this photograph of the Natchez Pilgrimage Court in 1937. Again, it's 1937, and they're doing sort of this Gone with the Wind outfit, again in 1937. So this is a photograph of Jane Wexler. She was a member of the Jewish community. She was the second queen of the Natchez Pilgrimage. Again, she's wearing this sort of Scarlett O'Hara getup. Her dress in this photograph is clearly hearkening back to this sort of mythic vision of the Old South that has absolutely no basis in the real lived experiences of the vast majority of Southerners and enslaved people. So now feels like a great time to introduce you to another amazing colleague from Natchez. Carter Burns is the executive director of the Historic Natchez Foundation, which preserves and tells the story of Natchez while stimulating development through the rehabilitation of historic properties. Carter and his colleagues are incredible supporters of Temple B'nai Israel and our ongoing restoration efforts. And I got the chance to chat with him about the foundation's important work preserving the built environment of Natchez and telling complicated stories about the city's past. So once again, I'm going to stop sharing the PowerPoint and I am going to share this video of my conversation with Carter.
My name is Carter Burns, and I'm the Executive Director of the Historic Natchez Foundation. I'm the third Executive Director that we've had. Ron Miller was the first one, and he served for about 30 years, and then his wife, Mimi, was the second one, and she served for about 10 years, and then I've been here 2 years now. But I'm from Natchez. I grew up in Natchez, and I worked at the foundation ever since I was a teenager, all through high school and college during the holiday breaks and everything. So I'm well versed in the work that the foundation does going way, way back. But the foundation was established in 1974 by a group of citizens who were concerned about the loss of the historic buildings that was happening in Natchez at the time. They were tired of seeing, just building after building being torn down and replaced with parking lots or just fall into disrepair. So they established the foundation as kind of a revolving fund to acquire those buildings and save them or find new owners who would then restore them and save them. And we've had a part in probably about a direct role in saving about 50 buildings or more since then, been involved in projects with countless others. And our role has expanded somewhat ever since that, well, actually expanded greatly ever since the initial founding. And now we're a local history center. We serve as an archive. We house the historic legal records for the county in our building. We have also have an eventual goal of having a museum of Natchez history in our building. So for many years now, we've been collecting artifacts and have established many collections of documents and other things that people have given us related to Natchez history over the years. We handle tax credit applications for tax credit projects, which is when somebody's restoring a building for use, commercial use again, and qualify through the historic tax credit program. We write National Register nominations. We help scholars do research on various topics. We have a great partnership with the Institute of Southern Jewish Life, where we are the local partners with the Temple B'nai Israel, and we give tours of it to visitors and locals. We organize tours for different groups that come to town. We are engaged in a little bit of economic development as well with reusing the historic resources we have here to build up the economy of the town. We, as you see behind me, do a weird thing, which is our biggest fundraiser, which is the Balloon Festival, which is a 3-day hot air balloon and music festival that we put on every year, the third weekend of October. So we just really do a whole lot of things. What we do is all about today, in the present, and the future. It's not really about the past. It's about the kind of community we want to make, and the things that we want to save that are good, that we want to carry forward, and things that we need to understand about the past in order to help us move forward as well. Well, Natchez was founded in 1716 officially when the French established Fort Rosalie here. Natchez sits on a bluff about 200 feet above the Mississippi River and has an amazing view of the river, which of course is the strategic reason that they built the fort there, because they can control up and down the river. And Natchez was then occupied, of course, first by the Native Americans, the Natchez Indian tribe, and then the French, the Spanish, the British, before it became part of America. And the Spanish laid out a grid plan for the downtown in 1790, and that is really how the town initially developed, right around that grid plan. The fort fell into disuse around 1800. It was not necessary anymore. So it developed around the grid, and the cotton gin was, of course, invented in 1795 and came to Natchez shortly thereafter. And so cotton became the biggest crop in the area. So all the landowners here started planting cotton, cultivating cotton. They had enslaved workforce that would, take care of the fields and grow the cotton. Across the river in Louisiana is Concordia Parish, and that land is very, very flat and very, very rich. So they owned a lot of plantations across the river, but they chose to live in Natchez because Natchez was the social center, and also it was on the high ground, so it would not flood. So we had a lot of the antebellum mansions that you think about when you think about Natchez that were built in the downtown grid, but also kind of surrounding the downtown grid in kind of a unique development pattern known as the suburban villas. So most of the homes that are open for tours are not actually plantation houses because they are not on plantations. They're suburban villas, but they still had Africans enslaved there, so they still have the outbuildings that were associated with enslavement. But then Natchez was not really damaged much in the Civil War. It was not of any strategic importance to either side during the war, so it surrendered quickly, was occupied by the Union Army. And then after the war, that's when the merchant class really took off, because you had all these newly freed African Americans who could now, they didn't have much money, but they did have some money. So you had more customers, and the merchant class started building houses and buildings all throughout the second half of the 19th century. And that is mostly what you see downtown today, is mostly the second part of the 19th century buildings with antebellum ones all sprinkled around. So then the boll weevil came along in the early 1900s, and then the Depression. So Natchez didn't get a lot of development in the first part of the 20th century. So because of that, we retained a lot of our 19th century character, which is what we're known for and what people come here to see. We have pretty well believe that Adams County has more existing antebellum outbuildings than any other place in the country. Because as I mentioned, we had such great wealth concentrated here, and all of these planters had their own estate, and they needed multiple outbuildings to house the people and house the tasks that were necessary to run these estates and plantations. So those buildings have not been studied in nearly as much as the houses have. Many of the houses have been documented extensively. So we decided we were going to undertake a mission to document all of those buildings, and by documenting, I mean we were going to photograph them, take measurements of them, make measured drawings, and then all of those will be housed at the Library of Congress and will become part of the Historic American Building Survey, which is also known as HABS. It will be there forever for scholars to be able to access. So these are the buildings that are most closely associated with the enslaved people who worked at these houses. And so by studying them, you really get to learn more about those people, more about what their daily life was like, more about what their living conditions were, just, you know, everything about them. You can learn the buildings themselves, the way they're laid out and the way they are sited on the property. You know, there's a lot you can tell from the spatial relationship of how they wanted service to be a little bit further away, but also needed to be able to keep an eye on the people that they enslaved as well. So, you know, lack of privacy, those types of things. We're learning a lot, and it's been really fascinating. We hope to make a publication once we're finished and have some articles and other scholarship come from this. We're working in conjunction with Texas A&M University, a professor there, and so he's going to be bringing students when they're allowed to travel again, and the students will take part in the process of documenting these buildings. Well, what I would hope that a visitor would take away is how complex and layered the history is here, and that Natchez is blessed because we have so many sites that interpret that history. So you can really, if you choose to, you know, get a full picture of the history, you know, everything from the Native American history to Reconstruction and civil rights history. We have sites that interpret all of those things. So you can really cover a lot of ground and gain a lot of knowledge of history here.
Amazing. So I want to transition right away into a conversation that I had with Daryl White. He is the director of cultural and heritage tourism for Visit Natchez, and he's also the executive director emeritus of the Natchez Museum of African American History and Culture. He's also an incredible living history performer, which we didn't talk about a ton in this conversation, but I think is something fascinating to know about him. I really loved talking to him about his family connection to public history, and sort of the immense pride that he takes in Natchez and its history. So I'm going to go ahead and share that conversation now.
Well, good afternoon. My name is Daryl White. I'm Director of Cultural Heritage Tourism for Visit Natchez, the destination marketing organization that promotes information about the historic city of Natchez that are utilized and absorbed by people all over the world. I also happen to serve as the Executive Director Emeritus of the Natchez Museum of African American History and Culture. The city of Natchez has a very extensive and outstanding history, having been the first incorporated European settlement along the entire length of the Mississippi. The city of Natchez recently commemorated its tricentennial. When you think 1716, some 60 years before the signing of the U.S. Declaration of Independence. It was somehow the will, I'm going to say, of some of my ancestors that I ended up doing the work that I do. I had a great uncle who was a historian by passion. He never went beyond the 8th grade. However, he had a ferocious appetite for learning, for reading. He and I had a very unique relationship from the time I was, just a mere youth and living on opposite ends of the country as I was in New York City and he was living in Los Angeles. Uncle Bill would write me letters, and at the end of the letter pose a question to which I was supposed to look up the answer and write them back. And being a mere youth at the time, I may not have written back with the expediency that he was expecting. And another letter would come and say, "You didn't answer your question. Here's that question again, and something else I want you to look up for me." So I had to do some research to answer Uncle Bill's questions. And in the process, he and I would learn and talk history. When I relocated and moved to the city of Natchez, to the area and community where my mother had been born, and I came here to get her settled for her retirement, learning that I was here, Uncle Bill said, "Well, I guess it's time for me to come home too." He was 79 years old when I moved him from Los Angeles here to Natchez. In the year 1990, a group of women within this community established the Natchez Association for the Preservation of African Culture. That group founded and established the museum. Well, they were looking for artifacts to go into that museum. And wouldn't you know it, when I brought Uncle Bill from California in the largest truck that U-Haul had on their lot, as a then 79-year-old, he didn't discard much of anything and had plenty of stuff to donate for some of the exhibitry that would go into the museum because of his passion for that history. And then my mother jumped in on the bandwagon. And it was pretty much obvious that I too would develop a passion for that cause. And was fortunate to be able to spend a number of years taking that small museum and making it into a historic destination, informative historic destination. One of the major focus of the museum is to explain and to display elements of triumph over adversity. It is not necessarily a slavery museum. You mentioned the Forks of the Road, which was the Deep South's second largest enslavement marketplace. But that site also served as a site of freedom. You can learn from some of the early documented histories of people of African origin and descent at that museum. There's information about the vibrant community of people of African descent throughout the period of Reconstruction. There had been more free people of color in the city of Natchez than anywhere else in the nation, in the state of Mississippi, during that period of Reconstruction. Natchez elected a black mayor during Reconstruction. The first man of color to hold any official office in any capacity in the state of Mississippi was John Roy Lynch, who left the city of Natchez as a member of the state legislature. He became Speaker of the House, left there and became a member of the United States Congress. There was the stories of the Reverend Hiram Road Revels, who was pastor of the Zion Chapel African Methodist Episcopal Church here in Natchez, who left here and became the first man of color to serve in either house of the United States Congress, as he was the nation's first black United States senator. all from right here in this river city. The area was home to Richard Nathaniel Wright, internationally acclaimed author. There were much more antebellum structures here that we found collectively in any other part of the nation. Prior to the Civil War, there were more millionaires here per capita than we found anywhere else in the nation. Natchez was very instrumental in securing its place in the further development of the nation's economy, as Natchez having been ground zero to what had become the nation's #1 cash crop and moneymaker, the cotton that was grown in the Mississippi River region. The homes of many of those cotton barons still exist, as Natchez was spared any direct involvement with any of the major battles of the Civil War. For a number of years, there was a thought that the contributions of people of African origin and descent didn't amount to much, that they had no real history to speak of. So history was deemed the world and domain of whites, and blacks folks had heritage. But some years ago, the Historic Trust for Historic Preservation changed or expanded upon the definition of heritage. Race was removed from the interpretation, and it became the culture of the people in a given area. The cultural heritage tourism or tourist comes into a community for a specific reason. They have an interest not to just pass through, but to learn something about those people in that area. And as much as they can, they want to know, what did they do? How do they live? What do they eat? Where can I find some of that stuff? So there is, again, an extensive history and stories to be told to any and all who are eager and want to learn. Natchez in itself is unlike any other community that you will find anywhere else, particularly in the state and in this country, which makes it truly the jewel on the Mississippi.
So I'm really interested in how the history of Jews in the South intersects with other Southern stories, including histories of Native American history and culture, slavery, the Civil War, Reconstruction, Jim Crow, and the Civil Rights Movement. And I think that Natchez is a perfect, or I guess more accurately, deeply imperfect encapsulation of this intersection. So I want to sort of update all of you about what's happening at Temple B'nai Israel right now. So at Temple B'nai Israel, we welcome supporters from around the region to learn about Jewish history and to experience music and theater and the arts in the synagogue's historic sanctuary. We are embarking on a renovation and rehabilitation project to ensure that the building is preserved for future generations. This has included installing a wheelchair access ramp along the side of the building, as well as adding appropriate fire exits on both levels of the building. And we're telling the story of Jews in Natchez because their story is really the story of the Jewish South and the American Jewish experience writ large. The Natchez Jewish community is now just under 10 people. There will be a time when there's no living Jewish presence in Natchez. And so our goal is to transform Temple B'nai Israel from a synagogue into a community gathering space, an event venue, and a museum telling the story of Jews in Natchez. Over the past few years, as I accidentally previewed for you minutes ago, we've put on plays and concerts at the temple, and there's so much more to come along those lines. We're currently working to replace the building's outdated electrical system and install a fire suppression system with support from a community heritage preservation grant from the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. So if the story of Natchez and its Jewish community is compelling to you and you want to see it preserved for future generations, I encourage you to donate to the Temple B'nai Israel Restoration and Preservation Fund. I'm going to throw that link in the comments right now so you have it, and I'll also pin it to the top of these comments so it's easily accessible to everyone. So this was a lot of information. I would love to answer some questions from you. So I'm going to look over at the Facebook chat to see what folks are asking, and we can go from there. Again, if you have questions, please, please, please put them in the comments. I'll try to get to as many of them as I can right now. And then again, if you continue to have questions, please continue putting them in the comments. You can respond to the emails that we're sending about this program, because I want to make sure that everyone can participate in this as fully as possible. So let me just scroll up to see what some of these questions are. So we have one question from Milton who asks, were the mounds built to avoid flooding? So that's a great question. I am by no means the expert on mound building practices of Native Americans in North America. Something that Lance mentioned in my conversation with him that I wasn't able to include in the video was that he sort of likened mounds, which were largely built for sort of ceremonial purposes or to sort of elevate certain buildings or temples. Some of them were used for burial, but he likened them to the Acropolis in Athens, Greece. So the Parthenon and many other temples and buildings are on the Acropolis because to sort of elevate them above the rest of the city and to sort of bring them closer to the heavens. So he sort of said that that was sort of a similar impetus for the way that mounds were built by the Natchez and by other sort of mound building societies in North America. So I'm taking a look at some other comments. I see Janet is telling us the story of her visit to Natchez in early March. Again, I'm so thrilled that you were able to visit and to meet with some of the colleagues who we featured in this session. I'm really hopeful that these presentations and the virtual vacation will spur some memories if you've been to these places. I'm sure that everyone watching, and I certainly would love to hear your stories of your travels to these places. So again, so thrilled that you were able to be there in the before times in March. Amazing. Just poking through to see some other questions. Awesome. So my colleague, Rabbi Matt Dreffin, is curious about classical versus contemporary Reform Judaism. Again, I'm not the expert on this. Rabbi Dreffin has helpfully linked Roots of Reform Judaism in the comments. But he caught on that I mentioned that Temple B'nai Israel is really a classical Reform synagogue. So the Reform movement is a really important part of sort of the story of the Jewish South. The Reform movement really has a lot of its roots in the South. And the story of the classical Reform movement is really a story of sort of assimilation and acculturation as Jews in the United States are wanting their worship style to maybe more closely resemble sort of the Protestant worship styles of their friends and neighbors. So when you see the interior of Temple B'nai Israel, you see that it's very front facing, you see there's an organ, and those things and that sort of incorporation of music and that sort of very frontal style might be a little bit unfamiliar for someone who's more accustomed to sort of a more orthodox worship style. And the classical Reform movement does a lot of things to sort of eliminate some traditions that would maybe make Judaism seem sort of more foreign. I don't know that I'm phrasing that exactly the way I want to be, but things like having the service be almost entirely in English, having, using a yarmulke and a tallis as maybe not something that's super common in a classical Reform space. So again, the wonderful website that Rabbi Dreffin has linked in the comments should be super helpful for folks about that. But that's sort of a general gist of what sort of classical Reform looks like. And again, if you're sort of familiar with the more contemporary Reform service, that seems a little different, right? Because there's much more Hebrew now. A yarmulke would be much more common now. A tallis would be much more common now. And so sort of it really speaks to the way that Jews have assimilated and acculturated over time in the United States and the ways that has sort of grown and changed. I'm taking a look at some other comments. Let's see, why are there only 10 oh my goodness, so many came all at once. Why are there only 10 Jews in Natchez today? So this is something that I didn't mention super explicitly in the presentation, but sort of as the cotton economy dwindled and as sort of the rise of big box stores happened throughout the 20th century, a lot of those Jewish businesses sort of fell by the wayside. And there's a generation really of Jews in Natchez who move out of Natchez for their education and then don't return, and then their children don't return. So there's a wonderful sort of widespread community throughout the United States of folks who are really connected to Natchez, but not a lot of them are living in the city in the present. Natchez at this point is really sort of a tourism economy, right? People are coming to visit museums and historic homes and things like that. And so there's not necessarily a lot of opportunity for younger Jews who might want to move back to the city. So the population of the town has dwindled, as it has in a lot of sort of small communities. And that's also really not, that problem is not exclusive to the Jewish community, as you can imagine. But so the population of Natchez is about 10 Jews at present, but all of them are very dedicated, and we work as a team to preserve and tell the story of Jews in Natchez. Are there tours of Natchez if I wanted to visit? Yes. So if you want to visit Natchez, you can go to the website of Temple B'nai Israel, which is natcheztemple.org. That link is in the comments, and I will throw it in there again. You can also reach out to me. You can find my email address on that website or on the ISJL website to schedule a tour of the temple. Our wonderful community members in Natchez, as well as the Historic Natchez Foundation, offer tours. If you're thinking of a tour sort of Natchez overall, Visit Natchez is a really wonderful resource. They can connect you to a lot of folks who are doing sort of overall tours. As well, all of the folks who spoke in this presentation today, Lance, Carter, and Daryl, are all really wonderful resources, and their contact information is available on all of their organizations' websites. And they can also all really help you tour Natchez as a whole. So yes, there are tour guides available for Natchez, and a lot of them are really wonderful. Let's see. Do you know of any diaries or writings telling about the relationship between Jewish people and the people who they enslaved? That's a really excellent question. I think that that's something that a lot of folks are really wondering about as we continue to sort of uncover this history. There's not anything specific off the top of my head that I know about, but I want to do more research into that and answer your question at a later point. If we wanted to take a tour of Natchez, who would want contact to take a tour that would include the outbuildings of the old mansions? So that's a great question. Again, Visit Natchez has sort of a resource to be able to point you to all of sort of the owners of those homes. Some of them are privately owned and some are publicly owned. And part of the initiative that Carter was telling us about, that sort of the Historic Natchez Foundation is doing a full survey sort of all of those outbuildings in Natchez. A lot of that is in service of this goal to have interpretation of these buildings more fully represent the people who actually lived and worked in them. I'm of the belief that if you tour a plantation in the South, if 90% of the people who lived on that plantation were enslaved, 90% of the tour should be about their experiences. Unfortunately, that's absolutely not the case in a vast majority of places. And it's something that Natchez is really working toward. So I think that really sort of depends on who the person is giving you a tour, but I would always encourage you that when you are touring a space where people were enslaved, that you're really looking with a critical eye and asking those questions, because there is information available. Sometimes it's much more limited than we would like it to be. But again, I think a lot of folks are really moving in the direction of having their tours of these spaces and their interpretation of these spaces be much more truthful and accurate to the actual experiences of the people who live there. So again, it really depends on where you are. But in Natchez, I would say, again, the Historic Natchez Foundation is a wonderful resource, and Visit Natchez has full listings of all of these homes that you can visit. Amazing. I don't know that I'm seeing any other comments, but if you have others, please let me know. Again, I'm so grateful that all of you are so engaged in this topic. It's a really big one. I want us to have sort of a whole session of the virtual vacation where we're talking about this topic of Jews and slavery. I think Natchez is a place where we can get into it a little bit, but not as fully as I would like to. And I think it's something that's really important for us to explore more fully. So again, thank you so much for all of your questions. I'm going to go back to sharing my screen for one moment. Awesome. So thank you all so much for tuning in. I hope that you'll sign up to continue receiving updates about the virtual vacation. We have a lot of exciting things in store for you in the coming weeks. Our next session is going to be sort of in a totally different tonal direction. We're affectionately calling it Summer Camp Magic. It's a celebration of the end of summer because it's the day after Labor Day, via an exploration of the history of Jews and summer camp. So if you were a camp kid or you have campers in your life, you don't want to miss this history of Jewish summer camp. I'm working on some of the research for it this week, and it's very exciting. And I think will be a lot of fun, and also hopefully be enlightening about how summer camp has become such sort of an American and an American Jewish institution. So I also, just to give you a little teaser, may or may not be planning to deliver this presentation from a tent. That's my plan. I'm also giving you a friendly reminder that you can sign up for updates about the virtual vacation and watch all of our past presentations, as well as read all of our weekly emails on our website, which is isjl.org/virtualvacation. That link is in the description of this video, but I'm also going to just put it in the comments right now so it's easily accessible. Thank you all so much for your time. I will see you right here, same place, same time next week. And thank you all so much.